She thought she'd just humiliated a sick old woman in front of 200 wedding guests. She had no idea she'd just made the most dangerous mistake of her life. The wig came free in Vanessa Albright's manicured hand, and the bare, pale scalp of the woman in the chair was suddenly exposed under the chandeliers of the Providence Biltmore ballroom. It had all started as a cruel little dare, a bet whispered between bridesmaids only minutes before. You wouldn't dare touch the old woman. So Vanessa leaned down with a smile as sweet as poison and said, loud enough for the front tables to hear, "You don't have to hide it anymore. It's just family here." Laughter cracked somewhere near the champagne fountain. What Vanessa didn't know, what none of those 200 guests knew, was that the groom had arrived 2 full hours early. Antonio Ferraro was 37 years old, 6 feet of tailored silence in a charcoal suit, and he was standing in the shadows behind the marble columns at the back of the room, watching every single second of it. To the outside world, he was just a quiet businessman who owned marinas and nightclubs along the Rhode Island coast. But everyone who mattered in Providence knew the truth. Antonio Ferraro was the boss of the Ferraro crime family, the most feared man in the city, and he lived by one unbreakable rule: nobody, ever, touches the people he loves. And the woman whose dignity had just been stripped away under those lights wasn't a stranger to him. Now he was beginning to walk, slow and certain, unbuttoning his jacket as he crossed the ballroom floor. 200 people had come to watch a wedding. Not one of them was ready for what a mafia boss does when someone humiliates his family in front of the whole world. If you believe quiet, loyal people deserve to be respected, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who's ever been underestimated for staying humble. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story where real dignity gets the last word. Now let's go back to that ballroom, to the exact moment the wig hit the floor, and see what happened next. The wig fell onto the polished hardwood floor of the Providence Biltmore's grand ballroom and lay there beneath the chandeliers like some small, pitiful animal. And in that moment, it seemed as though the entire room stopped breathing at once. Antonio stepped out of the shadows beyond the row of marble columns, and the first guests to recognize him began nudging one another, whispering under their breath, then falling completely silent when they saw his face. He didn't look at Vanessa. He didn't look at the bridesmaids who had been laughing only moments earlier and were now pale with fear. He looked only at the woman seated in the velvet chair at the head table, the woman struggling to hold her head high even as her shoulders trembled faintly, and her thin hands clasped each other tightly over the lavender silk of her dress. He walked slowly, one measured step at a time, the way a man walks when he has no reason to hurry because the whole world is already waiting for him. And as he crossed the room, he quietly unbuttoned the charcoal gray suit jacket he was wearing. There wasn't a sound except for the steady tapping of his shoes against the hardwood floor. The chamber ensemble in the corner had stopped playing at some point, though no one had noticed when. When he reached the chair, Antonio said nothing to the crowd, staring at him. He bent down and gently draped the jacket, still warm from his body, around the woman's narrow shoulders, drawing the collar high enough to cover the bare head the lights had so cruelly exposed. Then he lowered himself onto one knee until he was level with her, his face directly before hers, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough to be meant for her alone. Yet in the absolute silence of the room, all 200 people heard every word. "I'm here now, Mom," he said. "I'm here now." And the instant the word Mom left his lips, a shiver swept through the ballroom like a wave of cold air. The woman Vanessa had just humiliated in front of everyone, the woman she had mockingly called Mom in that falsely sweet voice, was truly the groom's mother. Rosalind Ferraro lifted her eyes to her son, and within them, beneath the humiliation and the pain, something seemed to break apart and then mend itself again. The look of a mother who knew that even if the entire world turned its back on her, there was still one person who never would. She raised a trembling hand and touched her son's cheek, the same gesture she had made since he was a little boy, and he allowed her hand to remain against his face for another second, then another, paying no attention to the hundreds of phones now held in the air. Behind them, near the champagne table, Vanessa stood rooted to the spot, the sensation of the wig still lingering in the memory of her hand, even though it was already lying on the floor, and the vicious smile she had worn only moments earlier had frozen into something that looked far more like fear. Slowly, and far too late, she began to understand that the woman she had just stripped bare before the crowd wasn't some distant aunt who could be turned into the punchline of a foolish wager. She was the mother of the man Vanessa was about to marry. She was Antonio Ferraro's mother. Charlie, Antonio's younger brother, stood not far away beside the wedding cake table, and the champagne flute in his hand tilted until a thin stream of wine spilled across his knuckles without him even noticing. He watched his brother kneeling beside their mother, watched Antonio's face, and a terror he couldn't name began rising inside him, because he knew his brother better than anyone else in that room, and he knew Antonio's silence had always been more frightening than any other man's scream. Antonio rose very slowly. He adjusted the collar of his jacket around his mother's shoulders one final time, as carefully as though he were tucking a blanket around her. Then he turned to face Vanessa, and for the first time in that long, unbearable moment, he looked directly into her eyes. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, and that look made Vanessa take half a step backward before she even realized she had moved. There was no rebuke, no shout, no threatening gesture, and that was precisely what made the witnesses feel the hair rise along the backs of their necks, because every one of them sensed that they were standing before a storm that had not yet broken, a punishment being held in check behind those horrifyingly calm eyes. Somewhere at the far end of the room, a glass accidentally touched a plate with a faint chime, and that tiny sound echoed through the stillness like a bell. Rosalind pulled the edges of her son's jacket more tightly around herself, and amid all the eyes fixed upon her, she searched the crowd for one face alone, a face she knew would understand her better than anyone else there, the face of a young woman standing motionless at the edge of the room with a trembling serving tray in her hands. But no one had noticed that young woman yet. No one knew who she was, and no one could have guessed that her presence in that room tonight would change everything in ways not one of those 200 guests could possibly imagine. The young woman standing at the edge of the room was named Katie Boone, and until this moment, she had been trying to do exactly what banquet servers were always taught to do, which was to become invisible. She was 27 years old, dressed in the black and white uniform issued by the catering company, her brown hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, and for the past 2 hours, she had moved between tables draped in silk, pouring wine, clearing plates, and offering polite smiles to guests who never bothered to look at her face even once. It was work she knew well, the kind of work where people looked straight through you as though you were merely part of the scenery, and most of the time Katie didn't mind, because invisibility had its own value, giving her a quiet space to think about the bills that needed paying, the evening classes she was taking, and the little nephew waiting for her at home. But when the wig fell to the floor, when she heard the sweet and cruel voice of the woman in the brass-colored dress, Katie dropped the silver tray she was carrying, and its clatter disappeared into the confusion so completely that no one heard it except Katie herself. Because she recognized the woman sitting in that velvet chair. She recognized her from the very first second her face was exposed beneath the lights, even though 4 years had passed, even though she had grown so much thinner since then. It was Rosalind. It was the woman who had once held Katie's hand in a cold hospital corridor years ago. The woman with the warm, raspy voice who had told her stories to pass the time, while the intravenous medicine dripped slowly. The woman Katie had thought about more times than she could count since they had lost touch. And now she was sitting there, stripped of her dignity before 200 people, while Katie stood rooted to the spot, her hands still trembling, not knowing what she was allowed to do, not knowing what right a banquet server had to step into the middle of a tragedy that didn't belong to her. What Katie didn't know at all, what no one had ever told her, was that tonight's wedding was the wedding of Rosalind's son. When the catering company assigned her this shift 3 days earlier, they had given her only an address, a time frame, and a uniform that needed to be neatly pressed. No one had told her the name of the family hosting the event. No one had told her that the woman she had once cared for, the woman toward whom she still carried a quiet gratitude, would be in that room as the groom's mother. Katie had simply assumed this was another job like all the others, one more evening to earn a little extra money in wages and tips, one more evening of standing upright for 6 hours in shoes with worn soles. She had no idea that her presence here tonight was a pure twist of fate, an unexpected reunion quietly set in motion by destiny long after they had lost touch. Now, in the suffocating silence of the ballroom, as Antonio rose and turned to face Vanessa, Rosalind let her gaze move across the crowd. She wasn't searching for pity in the eyes fixed on her. She wasn't looking for the familiar faces of relatives or family business associates. She was searching for one person alone, and when her eyes met the pale face of the young woman standing at the edge of the room, with the fallen tray at her feet, something in her expression softened. In that brief moment, amid all the humiliation, Rosalind recognized her. Katie saw that look, and tears immediately gathered at the corners of her eyes. Not the tears of an outsider witnessing a painful scene, but the tears of someone who had just watched a person she loved being hurt right in front of her, and had been powerless to stop it. She gave a faint shake of her head, her lips moving around words that made no sound. Perhaps an apology, perhaps the words "I'm here." Though even she didn't know what she was trying to say. The contrast between her and the woman in the brass-colored dress couldn't have been clearer. One had just used her carefully manicured hands to strip an ailing old woman of her dignity, merely to win a wager, while the other would have willingly sacrificed the entire shift and every small dollar she would earn from it for the chance to walk over, wrap her arms around that old woman, and tell her that everything would be all right. Katie didn't care who these wealthy guests were, how expensive this room was, or whether stepping out of her place as a server might cost her the job. She saw only Rosalind, and inside her, something had already decided that she couldn't remain still forever, that no matter what it cost her, she would find a way to reach that woman before the night was over, because 4 years earlier, when Katie had nothing and was no one, Rosalind had been the one person who hadn't looked through her, as though she were invisible. Antonio remained standing across from Vanessa, and while she was still struggling to find her voice, he slipped one hand inside the left breast pocket of his suit jacket and drew out a cream-colored envelope. The gesture was so slow and composed that it almost made people forget what a humiliating spectacle the room had witnessed only minutes earlier. He said nothing. He simply held out the envelope, placed it into Vanessa's hands, the same hands that had been holding his mother's wig moments before, then stepped back half a pace and waited. Vanessa looked down at the envelope, then up at his face, and possibilities began racing through her mind. She had expected fury. She had braced herself for shouting, perhaps even to be thrown out of the reception in front of everyone. But this, an envelope handed to her with an almost unsettling politeness, was something she had never anticipated. And because Vanessa was the kind of person who always believed the world would eventually turn in her favor, she convinced herself in the space of a heartbeat that this had to be an attempt at reconciliation. Perhaps there was a check inside to settle the matter quietly. Perhaps it held some private message meant to preserve the dignity of both families. Perhaps Antonio, the cold and practical man she was about to marry, had decided that a scandal in the middle of a wedding benefited no one, and that he wanted to close the matter discreetly. A faint smile began returning to the corner of her mouth, the smile of someone who believed she had once again escaped the consequences. She tore open the envelope right there, in front of 200 guests, in front of dozens of phones still raised and recording, her carefully manicured fingers ripping through the cream paper with hurried, almost eager movements. There was no check inside. There was no affectionate note. What her fingers pulled out was a stack of photocopied documents. And across the top of the first page, printed in bold, was a line that took her a moment to understand, a copy of a property transfer file filled with dizzyingly long numbers and dense legal clauses. Her eyes moved down the page, confused at first, then slowing when they reached the bottom, where there was a signature she recognized. Beside it, circled in red ink by a hand that wasn't Antonio's, was a small seal marked as irregular by the legal department, along with a clearly noted date. The smile on Vanessa's face began to disappear, draining away as though water were slipping through a floor drain. Near the wedding cake table, Charlie tightened his grip around his champagne glass until his knuckles turned white, then looked away, unable to face the pages in Vanessa's hands, as though merely seeing them might pull him into something he had prayed would never be exposed. Vanessa lifted her eyes, and for the first time that evening, there was no arrogance left on her face, only a panic she was struggling to contain. She opened her mouth to say something, an explanation, a denial, but no sound came out. Antonio watched her with the calm of a man reading the morning weather report, and when he spoke, his voice was so soft that the people farther away had to hold their breath to hear him. "You should have read it," he said, "before you tore it open." Then he didn't wait another second for her reaction. He turned his back on Vanessa and faced his mother again, leaving her standing there with the papers trembling in her hands and 200 pairs of eyes trying to read her face and understand what had just happened. The entire room fell silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence now, a silence crowded with questions no one had yet dared to speak aloud. No one in the ballroom understood the full meaning of those pages. No one knew whose signature it was, what fortune the transfer documents involved, or why Antonio Ferraro had entered his own wedding with a carefully prepared envelope tucked inside his breast pocket, as though he had known from the beginning exactly where the night would lead. There was only one thing everyone in the room could feel, as clearly as a chill moving down the spine. This quiet man had known something for a very long time, and the night Vanessa believed she controlled had, in truth, already been decided before she ever set foot inside that ballroom. To understand why the young banquet server's eyes filled with tears when she saw Rosalind humiliated, one would have to go back many years, to a part of Katie Boone's life she could scarcely bear to remember. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Providence, in a cramped second-floor apartment where the rattling of the heating pipes every winter became one of the familiar sounds of her childhood. Her father left when she was too young to remember his face, and her mother, a woman who worked 2 jobs at once to support her 2 daughters, was her entire world throughout those years. Katie had an older sister named Megan, 4 years her senior, whom she loved and admired more than anyone else. But life rarely showed mercy to families like hers. When Katie was 23, Megan died in a traffic accident on her way home after a night shift, leaving behind a little boy barely more than 2 years old named Noah, with no father willing to step forward and accept responsibility. Katie, who hadn't yet had the chance to decide where her own life was going, quietly took the child in without a moment's hesitation, because to her, Noah was the last part of the sister she had lost, the only reason she could still rise from bed each morning during the darkest months of her life. Then, 2 years later, before the wound of losing her sister had even begun to heal, her mother fell ill. Cancer, the doctors said, speaking the word in the gentle, professional tone Katie had learned to hate. The months that followed became a long procession of hospital corridors, nights spent asleep in a hard plastic chair beside the bed, medical bills piling so high that Katie was afraid to open the envelopes, and finally, a cold March morning when her mother's hand slowly grew lifeless inside her own. Her mother died, leaving Katie with a 6-year-old nephew to raise, and a mountain of hospital debt she would spend many years paying off. One installment at a time, month after month, on the wages of someone who did the jobs no one else wanted. Katie worked as a banquet server on weekend evenings, as a grocery store cashier during the day, and somewhere between all of that, she enrolled in an evening nursing program, because she had made herself a promise in that cold hospital corridor years earlier that one day she would be the person sitting beside other patients, that she would become the warm hand she had wished so desperately for during her mother's final hours. And it was in one of those hospital corridors, 4 years earlier, when she was still working part-time as a nursing assistant to pay her tuition, that Katie met Rosalind. The woman was undergoing her first round of chemotherapy then, alone in her hospital room through the endless afternoons, and Katie was the young aide assigned to care for her. It should have been only a passing professional relationship, like so many other patients who came and went, but something between those 2 women took root. Even while fighting the illness, Rosalind had a way of looking directly into Katie's eyes whenever she spoke, a way of asking about her life as though she were a real human being, rather than a shadow in blue scrubs moving quietly around the room. She told Katie stories about her younger years, asked about Noah, listened when Katie spoke of the mother she had recently lost, and over the course of those slow afternoons as the medicine dripped into her veins, the 2 of them became something closer to family than either had expected. Then Rosalind's course of treatment ended. She transferred to another hospital closer to home, and they lost touch in the way people so often lose one another in the current of life. But Katie never forgot her. What Katie didn't know, when the catering company called 3 days earlier to assign her a shift at the Providence Biltmore, was that Rosalind had arranged everything. Weeks before, the woman had quietly made inquiries, contacted the catering company, and ensured that the kind young nursing assistant from years ago would be given this particular shift, partly because she knew Katie needed the money, and partly for another reason Katie couldn't yet understand. Katie accepted the job as she accepted every other shift, with a quiet gratitude for each paycheck that brought her a little closer to paying off the debt, to buying Noah the new shoes his rapidly growing feet needed, to the day when she could wear a real nurse's uniform, instead of this black and white banquet uniform. She had no idea what room she was about to enter, whom she was about to see again, or what she was about to witness. She was simply a young woman carrying far too many burdens for her age, trying to live with kindness in a world that had rarely been kind to her in return. And tonight, when she saw that familiar face revealed beneath the chandeliers in the midst of such cruelty, all she felt was one overwhelming need, to reach the woman who had once treated her like a human being at the very moment when Rosalind needed a hand more than ever. Antonio took his mother out of the Providence Biltmore through a rear entrance, away from the phones and the curious eyes, and as the car pulled out of downtown and headed south, the rain began to fall. It wasn't a loud thunderstorm, but the steady, fine rain of late autumn in New England, the kind that asked for no attention and simply tapped against the windows like a friend sitting beside you who didn't need to say a word. Rosalind sat in the back seat, still wrapped in her son's charcoal gray suit jacket. Her bare head now covered by a soft knit cap. She always kept folded inside her handbag for moments exactly like this, though she had never needed to use it in public until tonight. Antonio sat beside her, one hand holding her thin, fragile fingers, and he said nothing. He didn't ask how she felt, because he already knew. 37 years as this woman's son had taught him that some kinds of pain didn't need to be solved with words, only endured in silence beside the person carrying them. The car followed the coastal road, and through the blurred veil of rain, Narragansett Bay appeared in the distance, dark and immense, the marina lights trembling faintly across the restless water. The Ferraro family estate stood at the end of a private road, a large gray stone house overlooking the bay, where Antonio had brought his mother to live after her illness grew worse, so she would always have someone caring for her, and so he could remain close. When they arrived, he helped her inside, waited while the housekeeper prepared a cup of warm tea, and only after Rosalind had gone upstairs to rest, after the vast house had fallen silent and there was nothing left but the sound of rain beyond the windows, did Antonio allow himself to sit alone in the unlit study and think. He thought about the moment the wig struck the floor, about the ugly laughter somewhere near the champagne fountain, and the cold anger he had restrained throughout the evening rose again inside his chest. But beneath that anger was something else, something Antonio had carried within him for a year and a half without speaking of it to anyone. 18 months earlier, during the week when his mother's oncologist first said the word metastasis, inside a consultation room washed in cold white light, Antonio had remained in his car for an entire hour in the hospital parking lot. He didn't cry, he didn't break anything, he simply sat there and thought in the way he always thought when facing a threat, coldly, methodically, several moves ahead. And during that week, while his entire world was reeling from the news that the woman who had given him life might not have much time left, Antonio quietly did something that no one in the family, no one in the machinery of his business, not even his mother, knew about. He began moving things. He called a lawyer he trusted absolutely, a discreet man who worked out of a small, unremarkable office, and together they began building something, a legal structure carefully constructed over the course of many months, a trust created not for display, but for protection. Antonio did it quietly, layer by layer, moving the most important things beyond the reach of any hand that might try to take them. And he did it for one reason alone, so that no matter what happened to him, no matter whether the underworld he ruled collapsed or turned against him, the woman sleeping upstairs would never have to worry about anything for the rest of her life. Antonio had never told his mother about it. He didn't want to place another fear upon everything her body had already been forced to endure. He didn't want her lying awake at night worrying about money, about property, about what would happen if one day her son were no longer beside her. So he kept it to himself, a secret buried deep, a safety net stretched through the darkness without a single living soul knowing it existed. Sitting there in the darkened room, listening to the rain beat its steady rhythm over the bay, Antonio understood that tonight, the ruined wedding, the envelope inside his jacket, all of it was only the surface of something far deeper that he had been quietly preparing for a very long time. Vanessa and the people behind her believed they were playing a game of chess in which they held the advantage. They had no idea that this quiet man had made his first moves 18 months earlier, during the darkest week of his life, and that everything they believed they might seize had perhaps never truly been within their reach at all. He looked out at the rain beyond the window, and inside him, the cold anger slowly settled into something firmer, a resolve sharpened by time, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Antonio Ferraro wasn't born a boss, nor had he ever dreamed of becoming one. He became the man he was because, when he was 19 years old, his father, Salvatore Ferraro, fell on a sidewalk outside a restaurant in Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood, and in the space of a single night, the weight of an entire family and everything tied to the Ferraro name came crashing down onto the shoulders of a young man who hadn't yet had time to grow up. His father belonged to an older generation, a generation of men who had come from Calabria, Italy, men who built their power from the narrow streets of the Italian immigrant district under a code of their own that the city police rarely managed to reach. It was a world of loans made without paperwork, gambling rooms hidden behind closed doors, and business along the docks where no one asked questions. A world Antonio, as a boy, saw only in fragments, in the hushed conversations held in the kitchen after midnight, in the unfamiliar men who came and went, in the way his mother tightened her grip on his hand whenever they passed certain streets. He had never been prepared to inherit it. But after his father died, the men circling that small empire began to smell the vacancy left by power, and Antonio understood that if he didn't step forward and take control, his mother and his younger brother, Charlie, would be the ones forced to pay the price. So he stepped forward. He learned how to survive in a world that didn't forgive weakness, learned how to make others listen without raising his voice, learned that silence and calculation were always more frightening than aggression. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Antonio did something his father had never imagined. He began drawing the empire he had inherited out of the shadows and gradually into the light. He understood that power built on violence and fear came with an expiration date, that sooner or later it would either collapse or put a man behind bars, and he wanted something more lasting for his family. So he invested. He bought marinas along the Rhode Island coast when they were struggling and transformed them into luxurious harbors. He opened nightclubs in downtown Providence, places where the city's elite stood in line for the privilege of entering. He acquired real estate, one building after another, until a significant portion of the city's skyline bore his invisible fingerprints. To the outside world, Antonio Ferraro was now a successful businessman, a quiet investor who wore expensive shoes and sat in gleaming conference rooms. But those who truly understood knew that beneath the polished legal exterior, the old network remained intact, the relationships, the debts of loyalty, the channels he had never completely severed, and it was that blending of 2 worlds that made him the most feared man in the city, a man who could sign a $1 million contract beneath bright lights and make an enemy disappear from the game with a single phone call made in the dark. And it was within that half-lit, half-shadowed world that the marriage to Vanessa Albright had been born, not as a love story, but as a transaction. The Albright family had once been one of the wealthiest and most respected dynasties in New England, a name tied to old banks, private clubs, and investments spread across the East Coast. But in recent years, their financial empire had begun to crack from within, and Preston Albright, the head of the family, was searching for an alliance that could save what remained. Antonio, for his part, saw in the Albright name a ticket into the deeper ranks of legitimate finance, an old and prestigious mantle that could help wash away the final traces of his family's past. The marriage had been arranged like a handshake between 2 empires, one possessing old money and a fading reputation, the other holding new power and rising ambition. Antonio had never loved Vanessa, and he had never pretended otherwise, not even to himself. He viewed the marriage the same way he viewed every other deal, as a calculation of benefit, position, and what each side could bring to the other. He had believed he understood exactly what he was entering, but sitting in the darkness that night, after everything that had happened beneath the chandeliers of the Providence Biltmore, Antonio began to realize that perhaps he was the one who had underestimated the other side, that the alliance he thought he controlled might be hiding something far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated, and that the woman he had nearly married, along with the father standing behind her, might never have entered the arrangement with the intentions they had claimed. By the following morning, all of Providence knew what had happened. The phone videos recorded inside the hotel ballroom had spread through the night, passed from one message to another, from one group chat to the next, and by sunrise, the story of the Ferraro wedding falling apart had become the subject of conversation in every cafe in Federal Hill, every drawing room among the city's elite, and every whispered telephone call between those who had been there the night before and those who wished they had been. People retold the moment the wig fell to the floor, the moment the quiet man knelt beside his mother, the moment the cream-colored envelope was placed into the bride's hands, and with every retelling, the story was embellished, exaggerated, and reshaped until no one could be certain where the truth ended and the rumors began. But there was one thing every version of the story agreed upon. No one wanted to be the person Antonio Ferraro believed had chosen the wrong side. In a penthouse apartment overlooking the river in downtown Providence, Charlie Ferraro hadn't slept all night. Antonio's 34-year-old younger brother sat on the edge of his bed in the darkness, his phone clenched tightly in one hand, reading the same messages over and over without daring to answer any of them. Charlie had always been the weaker of the 2 brothers, the one who had inherited their father's charm but not the steel in his older brother's spine, and for years he had lived beneath Antonio's shadow with a mixture of gratitude and quiet resentment that he had never dared admit, even to himself. The night before, when he saw the stack of documents in Vanessa's hands, when he saw the red mark identifying the irregular seal beside that signature, Charlie had felt the ground shift beneath his feet, because before anyone else in that room, he knew what that signature meant and where it led. He had hoped, desperately and foolishly, that the truth would never be exposed, that he could continue living forever within the false safety between his own terrible decisions. Now, as dawn slipped through the gap in the curtains, Charlie understood that the safety was gone, and he sat there trembling, trying to decide what he should do next, what he could possibly say to his brother, how he could explain something that couldn't be explained. At the estate overlooking Narragansett Bay, Rosalind woke early even though she had barely slept the night before. But it wasn't her own humiliation that troubled her, nor the videos spreading across the city, nor even her son's ruined wedding. What worried her was the young woman in the black and white serving uniform whose eyes she had met across the ballroom. Rosalind knew Katie had been there. She had seen the girl's face, had seen the tears in her eyes, and now she feared that because Katie had witnessed something so private and scandalous within the Ferraro family, the kind young woman might face trouble, might lose her job with the catering company, or worse, might be drawn into something she had never deserved to endure. Rosalind sat beside the window, looking out over the gray bay beneath a sky still heavy with the remnants of the night's rain, and within her, a quiet resolve began to form. She had to find Katie again. She had to make certain the girl was safe. But elsewhere in the city, inside a dark wood-paneled study at the Albright family residence, a very different conversation was taking place. Vanessa sat in a leather chair across from her father, her face stripped of every trace of the arrogance she had displayed the night before, leaving only a mixture of bitterness and fear. Preston Albright, a 60-year-old man with carefully groomed silver hair and eyes as cold as two stones, stood beside the window with his hands clasped behind his back, and he showed no anger over the wig incident, nor did he bother scolding his daughter for creating a humiliating spectacle before the entire city. The only thing that concerned him was the envelope. He made Vanessa describe exactly what had been inside those papers. Every detail, the signature, the red seal, the note identifying it as irregular, and the more he heard, the harder his expression became, because Preston Albright understood, in a way his daughter still didn't, that Antonio Ferraro had just sent a message, and that message hadn't been intended for Vanessa. It had been meant for him. Antonio knew something. He possessed something, and he had chosen to reveal it at the most humiliating moment possible, as a warning of what he could do if he wished. Preston turned to look at his daughter, and when he spoke, his voice didn't tremble. It was cold and calculating, the voice of a man who had spent his entire life inside rooms where money and power changed hands in the shadows. He told Vanessa that they wouldn't retreat, that a scandal was only a scandal, but what was truly under threat was far greater than that, and that the time had come to strike back. The plan father and daughter had been nurturing for a long time remained intact. It simply needed to move faster now, and it would require a degree of ruthlessness that even Antonio Ferraro had not yet begun to imagine. Antonio had begun following the trail many months before the cream-colored envelope appeared at the wedding, and now, in the quiet study overlooking the bay, he reopened everything he had gathered in silence. It had all begun with a small irregularity, the kind of irregularity only a man like Antonio, a man accustomed to checking every number, would have noticed. About 6 months earlier, while reviewing the accounts of one of the legitimate companies owned by the family, he discovered that a large sum of money had been withdrawn through a series of transactions cleverly disguised as operating expenses and payments to suppliers. Individually, none of the amounts was large enough to attract attention, but when Antonio put them together, the total reached a figure that made him sit in silence for a while. And what sent a chill down his spine wasn't the money itself, but the trail it had left behind. Every one of those transactions had been approved with an internal authorization code, a code assigned to only a very small number of people within the family, and the code that appeared again and again on every withdrawal, unmistakably, was Charlie's. Antonio spent weeks making certain. He wasn't the kind of man who accused someone, especially his own brother, on the strength of a suspicion. He checked, compared, and ruled out every other possibility, every scenario in which Charlie might have been innocent. But the deeper he went, the clearer the picture became, until it was impossible to deny. And finally, 2 days after that fateful wedding, Antonio summoned his younger brother to the estate overlooking the bay. Charlie arrived with the face of a man who hadn't slept for many nights, dark circles beneath his eyes, his hands unable to hide anywhere. He entered the study and sat across from his brother, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Antonio placed a file on the wooden desk between them. He didn't shove it. He didn't throw it. He simply slid it gently toward his brother and spoke in the calm, low voice Charlie had known since childhood. The voice he understood was more dangerous than any shout. "Tell me," Antonio said. "Tell me before I have to find the rest on my own." Charlie looked at the file, and the last of his defenses collapsed. He began speaking, his voice stumbling at first, then pouring out like water through a broken dam. He said it had begun with gambling debts, bets placed in casinos that he had hidden from everyone, figures that kept growing until he had no possible way to repay them. He said he had become desperate, had borrowed from people he should never have borrowed from, and then one day, a man came to him. A man who knew exactly how much he owed and exactly what he was afraid of. That man worked for Preston Albright. Charlie said that at first, they had only offered to help erase his debts, gently, almost kindly, and he had been naive enough to believe he could accept that help without paying the real price. But the price came quickly. They demanded that he use his authorization code to approve the transactions they chose. Sums of money withdrawn and then lost inside a maze of accounts he didn't understand and didn't dare question. Every time he hesitated, they reminded him of the debts, of what might happen to him, and worse, of what might happen to his family if Antonio ever found out. It was that fear, the fear of seeing disappointment in his brother's eyes, that bound Charlie to them and turned him into a piece on Preston Albright's board. He looked up at Antonio, his eyes red, and said he had never fully understood what he was helping them do, that he had told himself it was only money, only numbers, until he realized he had become the door through which those people entered his own family's home. Antonio remained silent throughout his brother's confession, his face revealing nothing, but inside, he was rearranging every piece. His anger was real, deep, and cold, but beneath it was something else, the pain of an older brother who had spent his entire life protecting this younger one, and now understood that the very protection he had given, the enormous shadow he had cast, might have made Charlie too afraid to come to him when he needed him most. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He only looked at his brother for a long time, then said quietly that the authorization code wasn't the only thing they had taken from Charlie, and that if Preston Albright had gone this far, then his true objective had never been merely a little stolen money, but something far greater, something the two brothers were now forced to uncover together before it was too late. In the days that followed, Antonio began pulling at every thread Charlie's confession had exposed, and the picture slowly emerging before him wasn't one of ordinary embezzlement, but of a conspiracy woven with meticulous care over many years. He had his people trace the accounts into which the stolen money had flowed, and those accounts led through a labyrinth of shell companies, businesses registered in different states under anonymous names, all of them eventually converging at a single point, financial entities connected indirectly but undeniably to the Albright family. The deeper Antonio dug, the more clearly he understood that the money Charlie had helped withdraw wasn't the objective. It was only a tool. Preston Albright didn't need that money. To a wealthy man like him, a few stolen $1 million meant very little. What he truly wanted were the transactions themselves, the trail they left behind, the fact that money had been moved through Ferraro family companies in a way that looked exactly like money laundering. And when that piece fell into place, Antonio felt a coldness run down his spine, because the entire plan revealed itself with terrifying clarity. The marriage to Vanessa had never been an alliance between two empires as he had believed. It was a doorway. By marrying his daughter into the Ferraro family, Preston Albright would gain something money alone couldn't buy: access from within. A legitimate foothold inside the empire Antonio had spent years building. As Antonio's wife, Vanessa would gradually acquire rights to shared property, to the companies, to the legal structures that marriage in this state granted a spouse. And once she had put down roots deeply enough, Preston's plan would move into its second stage, the cruelest stage of all. He would make certain that the financial trails resembling money laundering, the ones Charlie had unknowingly created, were discovered, delivered to the proper federal authorities, and presented in precisely the way needed to make every arrow point toward one man alone: Antonio Ferraro. Once Antonio was investigated, prosecuted, and sent to prison for money laundering, the empire he ruled would fall into a power vacuum, and the people already positioned to take control, through Vanessa and through the marital structures planted in advance, would be the Albright family. It was a move designed to spill no blood, a takeover carried out entirely through documents, law, and betrayal, and that was precisely what made it more dangerous than any war Antonio had ever faced in the underworld. Antonio sat with that truth for a long time, allowing it to seep into every corner of his mind. He thought of Preston Albright, of the man's stone-cold eyes during the meetings they had held to discuss the wedding, of the dry handshake and the smile that never reached those eyes. Antonio had read Preston as an arrogant relic of old money, clinging desperately to the last scraps of fading prestige, and he had been wrong. Preston wasn't clinging, Preston was hunting, and Antonio, despite all his caution, had nearly walked straight into the trap without realizing it, had nearly married the dagger and handed it the keys to every door in his home. But what troubled Antonio most, what he still couldn't fully place, was Vanessa's own role in all of it. How much did she know? Was she a calculating accomplice who understood every step of her father's plan, or merely a piece being pushed back and forth across a board without ever truly understanding the game she was part of? The reckless act at the wedding, ripping away the wig over a foolish wager, didn't resemble the behavior of a cold mastermind carrying out an intricate scheme. It looked more like the shallow impulse of a spoiled woman who had never been forced to pay for anything she had done. Antonio didn't rush to answer that question. He had learned long ago that misjudging a single piece could cost a man the entire game, and he wouldn't repeat the mistake that had nearly cost him his empire. There was only one thing he knew with certainty now. Preston Albright had made the opening move a long time ago, and it was Antonio's turn to answer, not with haste, but with the very weapon that had built his name, patience. While Antonio quietly reconstructed the entire conspiracy, in another corner of the story, Vanessa was searching for a way to salvage whatever power she still had left, and she did it according to the instincts of someone accustomed to using cruelty to conceal insecurity. After that night at her father's house, Vanessa understood that her position within the Ferraro family had been shaken to its foundations, and as she tried to determine whether anything could still be saved, she began paying attention to a detail she had overlooked in her panic that evening. She remembered Rosalind's gaze in the ballroom, the way the woman, amid all her humiliation, had searched the room for a banquet server standing at the edge of the crowd. Vanessa had heard fragments of conversation from the servants in the Ferraro household, that Rosalind had been asking about a female banquet worker, that she wanted to find her again, that some kind of connection existed between them, and with the sharp instincts of someone always searching for another person's weakness, Vanessa immediately realized that this young woman, though she was only an unknown server, possessed something Vanessa herself had lost, the trust and affection of both Rosalind and Antonio. That enraged Vanessa in a way she didn't bother to examine. She didn't need to know who Katie was. She didn't need to know where the connection between the young woman and Antonio's mother had begun. She only knew that if there was someone the Ferraro family cared about, then smearing that person and tearing her down would serve both as revenge and as a way for Vanessa to feel that she still held some measure of power in a situation rapidly slipping from her grasp. So Vanessa invented a story. She contacted the catering company that had provided the staff for the wedding, presenting herself as a wounded bride and an influential client, and reported that a valuable piece of family jewelry had disappeared during the reception. An expensive bracelet she claimed she had left inside the bridal dressing room. She suggested, with careful and calculated malice, that she had seen a female server lingering near that area during the evening, a young woman with brown hair tied neatly back, and that she believed the company should take a closer look at its employees. She didn't name Katie directly. She didn't need to, because she knew that a vague suggestion spoken by someone bearing the Albright name would be enough to set the machinery of suspicion in motion. And it did. The very next morning, Katie received a telephone call from the manager of the catering company, whose voice on the other end sounded cold and guarded in a way she had never heard before. They told her that a complaint had been made, that a valuable item was believed to have disappeared during the event where she had worked, and that until the matter was clarified, she would be temporarily suspended from all future shifts. Katie stood frozen in her small kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear, feeling as though the entire world were closing in around her. She tried to explain that she had never set foot inside the bridal dressing room, that she had never taken anything from anyone in her life, but she heard the doubt in her manager's voice, the kind of doubt she knew too well, the kind people like her always faced, people without money, without influence, without anyone standing behind them to offer protection. When the call ended, Katie collapsed into the chair beside the dining table, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt real fear rising inside her chest. It wasn't fear for her reputation, but something far more immediate and cruel. The banquet work provided income she couldn't live without. And worse than that, an accusation of theft, even an unproven one, was enough to threaten everything she had been struggling to preserve. She thought of Noah, of her 6-year-old nephew sleeping in the next room, of the fragile reality that her guardianship depended on proving that she was stable, employed, and without blemish. An accusation like this, if it spread, if it became attached to her record, could turn into a weapon someone might use to question whether she was fit to raise him. Katie covered her face with trembling hands. And in that moment, she had no idea that elsewhere in the city, a man had begun paying close attention to this small and deeply unjust situation, or that the injustice falling upon her was about to draw two lives that had no reason to cross closer together than ever before. News that Katie had been suspended and suspected of theft reached Antonio through his mother. After spending days persistently asking questions in an effort to find the young server whose eyes she had met across the ballroom, Rosalind finally learned her name and discovered the ordeal that had fallen upon her. And when she told her son, her voice trembled with anger in a way rarely heard from a woman as composed as she was. She told Antonio that the girl's name was Katie Boone, that 4 years earlier Katie had cared for her in the hospital with a kindness she had never forgotten, that she was the kindest person Rosalind had encountered during the darkest days of her life, and that she didn't believe the filthy accusation for even a second. Antonio listened to his mother, and when she mentioned that the Albright name stood behind the complaint, something inside him hardened. He didn't need his mother to beg. He only needed to know the truth, and he had the means to uncover it faster than anyone else. The wedding had taken place at the Providence Biltmore, and like every luxury hotel, it was equipped with an extensive security camera system that recorded every corridor, every passageway, and every door. Antonio had connections that made gaining access to the footage a simple matter, and in less than a day, he had every recording from that night in his possession. He reviewed them himself, frame by frame, following the movements of the brown-haired young woman in the black and white uniform throughout the entire evening. And what he saw wasn't the image of a thief. He saw a young woman working without pause for 6 straight hours, carrying trays, clearing tables, pouring wine, never once going near the bridal dressing room Vanessa had mentioned in her accusation. The footage showed clearly and beyond dispute that during the exact period when the bracelet was said to have disappeared, Katie was standing at the opposite end of the ballroom, serving a table full of guests, completely visible to the cameras. The accusation collapsed after only a few minutes of review, but Antonio didn't stop at proving her innocence through an intermediary. He wanted to meet the woman his mother valued so deeply, the woman who had been dragged into his family's tragedy through no fault of her own. He went to Katie's small apartment on the south side of the city, late one afternoon, and when she opened the door and saw the man in the dark suit standing on her narrow front steps, she instinctively took a step backward, because although she had never spoken to him, she recognized him, and she knew the stories people told about who he was. Antonio didn't step inside. He remained beyond the threshold, keeping a respectful distance, and told her in a low, steady voice that she no longer had anything to fear, that the accusation had been proven false, that the catering company would receive the evidence before the day was over, and that she would be reinstated with an apology. Katie stood there, trying to understand why this man had come personally to her home to tell her, and in her confusion, she blurted out a question. Why did he care? Antonio was silent for a moment, then told her that his mother had spoken to him about her, about what she had done for Rosalind 4 years earlier, and that in his family, debts of kindness were never forgotten, nor did they stand by while a decent person's name was stained because of someone else's wrongdoing. There was something in the way he said it that made Katie lift her eyes and look at him longer than she intended. And in that moment, between two people from worlds that couldn't have been farther apart, something quietly began to take root, fragile and unexpected. She saw in this frightening man, whom the entire city treated with caution, an unexpected tenderness toward his mother and toward what was right, and that unsettled her more than fear ever could. He saw in this struggling young woman an honesty and dignity that the hardships of life had never managed to wear away, something rarely found in the polished world of power he inhabited. But both of them immediately drew back from that moment, each for reasons of their own. Katie knew this man had almost married someone else, knew he belonged to a dangerous world, and that even the small glimpse of it she had witnessed was enough to make her shiver. She had a nephew to protect, a fragile life that didn't allow room for recklessness. Antonio, for his part, knew he was still in the middle of a war whose outcome had yet to be decided, and that drawing close to an innocent woman like her could pull her into the very danger he wanted to keep far away. So he only nodded in farewell, turned, and walked down the steps, and both of them carried away the strange feeling that something had just begun, though neither one dared to give it a name. After Katie's job was restored and the accusation withdrawn, Rosalind insisted on seeing the young woman she had valued and felt indebted to for so long and she invited Katie and her nephew to lunch at the estate overlooking the bay on a clear weekend afternoon. Katie hesitated, because she was still wary of the Ferraro family's world, but Rosalind asked in a warm voice that was impossible to refuse. And besides, Katie knew Noah needed to escape their cramped apartment and breathe some fresh air, so she agreed. And it was during that visit that Antonio happened to meet the 6-year-old boy named Noah. Antonio hadn't intended to be there. He stopped by the estate to discuss some business with his mother, and when he stepped into the garden behind the house overlooking the bay, he found a little boy crouching beside the rocky shore, studying something in the grass with the complete concentration only a child could possess. The boy looked up at him without the slightest trace of the fear the adults in this city always showed him, and asked, with startling directness, whether Antonio knew why the little crab ran sideways instead of straight ahead. Antonio, a man accustomed to rooms where every word was carefully weighed and every glance concealed an intention, suddenly found himself standing speechless before such unguarded innocence. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he lowered himself beside the boy on the rocks. He didn't know the answer about the crab, and he honestly admitted it, something he rarely did with anyone. Noah burst into laughter, bright and utterly unprotected, then began telling Antonio everything he knew about the creatures living along the edge of the bay, pointing, explaining, asking questions, drawing the stranger into his small and transparent world without having any idea who the man was. And as he sat there listening to the child's lively voice, Antonio felt something inside him, a shell hardened over many years, begin to crack, because this boy, fatherless and being raised by a woman who had sacrificed everything she possessed, reminded him of something he had buried so deeply that he had nearly forgotten it. He remembered himself at 19, standing before the emptiness his father's death had left behind, forced to grow up too quickly and carry too much too soon. He remembered what it felt like to lose the man who should have taught him things like why a crab ran sideways, and he realized that this child, without knowing it, was standing at the same fragile threshold where Antonio himself had once stood, needing something steady to lean upon. Rosalind came into the garden looking for her son, and when she saw Antonio sitting on the rocks beside Noah, their heads bent together over something in the grass, she stopped walking, and something inside her chest tightened before filling with warmth. She hadn't seen her son like this in a very long time. She hadn't seen that relaxed expression on his face since he was a boy, before the world placed far too much upon his shoulders. Rosalind herself also grew attached to Noah during that afternoon. With the instinctive sensitivity of children, the boy seemed to understand that the woman whose hair was growing back in short, soft strands was someone special, and he stayed close to her, telling her about school, proudly showing her the beautiful stones he had collected along the shore. And Rosalind, a woman who had spent months fighting illness and loneliness, found in the child's laughter a medicine no prescription could provide. Katie stood on the porch watching all of it, and an emotion she couldn't describe began rising within her. She had spent years carrying the responsibility of raising Noah alone, always afraid that he was missing too many things she couldn't give him. And now, seeing her nephew surrounded by this unexpected warmth, she felt something within her both comforted and made cautious, because she knew that beautiful moments like this were often fragile, and she knew the world these people belonged to still held dangers she had only begun to glimpse. But for now, beneath the late autumn sunlight spreading across the bay, with Noah's clear laughter ringing through the air, and the cold armor of the most feared man in Providence melting before a 6-year-old child, she allowed herself to believe, even if only for one afternoon, that perhaps not everything in this world was built upon calculation and fear, that sometimes a child and a little crab running sideways were enough to remind grown people of who they had once been before life taught them to become hard. The peaceful afternoon by the bay didn't remain in Antonio's thoughts for long, because as soon as he returned to investigating the Albright family's conspiracy, he began to realize something that turned his blood cold. Somewhere within his own inner circle, there was a breach. The first sign was very small, so small that a less careful man would have overlooked it entirely. Antonio had his people quietly prepare a legal move to freeze one of the shell companies Preston Albright used to move money, a step he kept under absolute secrecy and discussed only inside a closed room with a handful of people he trusted most. But when his men moved forward, they discovered that the company had already been dissolved and its assets transferred only hours earlier, as though the other side had known exactly what Antonio intended to do before he had even been able to act. He told himself it might have been nothing more than coincidence. But then the same thing happened a second time, and a third, and each time Antonio prepared to tighten his grip around one link in Preston's network, that link either disappeared or was reinforced just before he could reach it. And by the third time, Antonio no longer believed in coincidence. Someone was leaking information. Someone was sitting inside his private rooms, listening to his plans, then carrying them to the enemy. To Antonio, that thought was even more painful than the Albright conspiracy itself, because his entire life had been built upon loyalty, and betrayal from within was something even a man as seasoned as he was found difficult to accept. He began narrowing the circle of suspicion coldly and methodically, exactly as he approached everything else. He formed a list in his mind of everyone present at each meeting where information had later been exposed, and he began eliminating names. It wasn't Charlie, because his brother had confessed everything and was now under close supervision, with no further access to the most sensitive information. The loyal men who had served the family since his father's time were almost impossible for him to suspect. But when he carefully pieced everything together, when he compared exactly who had been present during the conversations that were later compromised, one name kept appearing, a name he didn't want to believe, a name that made his chest tighten merely to consider: Gregory Vance. Gregory was a longtime advisor to the Ferraro family, a 58-year-old man who had served the household since Antonio's father was still in power, a man with a cool head and a sharp legal mind, someone Antonio had trusted for nearly 2 decades to advise him on the most important decisions of his life. Gregory knew everything. He attended nearly every private meeting. He understood the family's financial structures better than anyone except Antonio himself. And for that very reason, if there truly was a traitor, no one was better positioned than Gregory to betray them. But that was also why Antonio hesitated. Accusing Gregory would be like accusing a part of his own family's history. And he knew that if he was wrong, if he allowed paranoia to guide him and turned against a loyal man, he might destroy with his own hands one of the last pillars still supporting him through the storm. So Antonio did what he always did. He didn't act hastily. He didn't confront Gregory. He didn't reveal the slightest trace of suspicion. Instead, he began watching his aging advisor through new eyes, noticing details he had never paid attention to before. The phone calls Gregory stepped outside to answer, the stretches of time when he disappeared without explanation, the way his eyes briefly shifted away whenever the Albright name was mentioned in the room. None of it was enough to prove anything, and Antonio knew that. But the atmosphere inside the Ferraro organization had begun to change, a quiet distrust creeping into every conversation, and Antonio understood that he was entering the most dangerous stage of the entire war, the stage when he could no longer be certain who was standing beside him. He thought of Katie, of Noah, of his mother resting peacefully at the estate overlooking the bay, and he realized that if there was an informant feeding information to Preston Albright, then it wasn't only his empire that was in danger. The people he had owned. That thought hardened his determination to uncover the truth at any cost, before the traitor had time to strike again. Preston Albright understood that time was no longer on his side. The ruined wedding had revealed that Antonio knew far more than Preston had believed, and every passing day brought Antonio closer to unraveling the entire network Preston had spent so many years building. So Preston decided to accelerate the final stage of his plan, the finishing blow he had been preparing for a long time, and he designed it as a trap so intricate that even a man as cautious as Antonio would find it difficult to escape. Preston's idea was simple and merciless. He would arrange a meeting with Antonio, one that appeared to be an attempt at reconciliation between the two families after the scandal, a private conversation between two men seeking to settle everything peacefully. But that meeting would be a trap laid in advance. Preston would arrange for forged financial documents, carefully manufactured to resemble evidence that Antonio was operating a money laundering network, to be placed within precisely the right context to make them believable. He would record the conversation in both sound and image, then cut and edit the footage so that Antonio's harmless words sounded like confessions. Immediately afterward, the entire fabricated package of evidence would be delivered to the federal authorities, to the right people at the right moment, ensuring that when the law tightened its net, it would close around Antonio Ferraro's throat and no one else's. It was a plan that required no bullets, an assassination carried out entirely through documents and lies, and Preston believed it was perfect. But what Preston failed to anticipate was one link he had dismissed, a seemingly harmless link that existed beyond every calculation he had made, and that link was Katie. Vanessa, driven by bitterness and the carelessness of someone accustomed to boasting, had revealed too much. During one of Katie's visits to the estate to see Rosalind, She happened to be present when Vanessa stopped by to collect a few personal belongings she had left behind, and while she waited, Vanessa spoke on the phone in a corner of the hallway, where she believed no one could hear her. But Katie, who had learned how to become invisible after years of working jobs where people looked straight through her, was standing close enough and quietly enough to hear fragments of the conversation. She heard Vanessa mention an upcoming meeting, heard her say that her father had prepared everything, heard words like files and federal, and finished this once and for all spoken in a tone of triumph that made Katie's blood run cold. Katie didn't understand every detail, but she understood enough to recognize that something terrible was being prepared against the man who had personally come to her home to defend her honor. The man with a troubled younger brother and a mother she loved, the man she had begun to care about, even though she didn't want to admit it. And Katie found herself facing the most difficult choice of her life. She could remain silent, pretend she had heard nothing, return to her small and safe existence, and stay far away from the dangerous world whose involvement could cost her everything: her job, her peace, perhaps even her guardianship of Noah, if she were drawn into a matter connected to the underworld. Or she could speak, accept the risk, and step directly into the very storm that reason told her to avoid. She remained awake through the entire night, sitting beside Noah's bed and watching her nephew sleep. And she thought of her mother, of everything her mother had taught her about doing what was right even when it came at a cost. She thought of Rosalind, and how deeply the woman would suffer if she lost the son who had sacrificed everything for her, and by morning, Katie had her answer. She found a way to contact Antonio, and when she met him, she told him everything she had heard, her voice trembling but her eyes steady, and she said that she didn't know much, but she knew one thing with certainty, that someone was setting a trap, and that the meeting proposed by the Albrights wasn't an attempt at reconciliation. Antonio listened to her, and as he did, he felt two things rising inside his chest at once. The first was a cold confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect, the final piece settling into its proper place. The second was a depth of emotion he hadn't expected, because he understood exactly how much the young woman standing before him had risked by choosing to step out of the safety of her shadows to warn him, a man she owed nothing, a man who belonged to a world she should have been running from. He looked at her, and he knew that this quiet courage, the kind of courage that required no audience, was the rarest thing his money and power had never been able to buy. What Preston Albright didn't know, what even Vanessa failed to understand, was that Antonio had been one long move ahead of them for weeks. Katie's warning wasn't new information to him, but the final confirmation of something he had quietly set in motion. Because the truth about Gregory Vance, the truth Antonio had been digging toward throughout those days of suspicion, had come to light before Preston had time to spring his final trap. When Antonio began watching his aging advisor through new eyes, he didn't stop at suspicion. He had Gregory discreetly followed, examined his calls, his meetings, and the unusual sums of money connected to him, and piece by piece, a picture emerged that couldn't be denied. Gregory Vance had betrayed him, but the betrayal ran deeper than Antonio had imagined, because it wasn't new. Years earlier, when the Albright financial empire first began to fracture, Preston had quietly approached Gregory, using old secrets and enormous payments to purchase the advisor's loyalty. And from that moment forward, Gregory had lived a double life, one foot inside the Ferraro family, and the other inside Preston Albright's pocket. He was the eyes and ears that had carried every one of Antonio's plans to the outside. He was the reason each link in Preston's network vanished just before Antonio could tighten his grip around it. But instead of confronting Gregory the moment he discovered the truth, instead of punishing the traitor in the way the underworld usually punished betrayal, Antonio did something far colder and far more intelligent. He remained silent. He allowed Gregory to continue believing that his treachery hadn't been discovered, to continue sitting inside private rooms, to continue listening to Antonio's plans. There was only one difference. From the moment Antonio learned the truth, the plans Gregory heard were no longer the real ones. Antonio began carefully feeding his disloyal advisor false information, fabricated moves, and weaknesses deliberately staged for him to see. And Gregory, never realizing what was happening, faithfully carried all of it back to Preston Albright as though it were pure gold. The trap Preston believed he was constructing had, in truth, been built upon a foundation Antonio himself had placed into his hands. When Katie warned him about the false reconciliation meeting, Antonio already knew exactly what Preston intended to do, and he had known in advance, because through Gregory, he had subtly led Preston into believing that this was the perfect moment to strike. Antonio entered that meeting not as prey walking into a trap, but as a hunter who had already laid one of his own. Preston had prepared forged documents designed to frame Antonio for money laundering and had arranged recording equipment so his words could be edited and twisted. But what Preston didn't know was that Antonio's people had taken control of the room before the meeting began. That every one of Preston's recording devices was capturing a script Antonio had already written, and that the forged documents Preston brought as evidence against Antonio had been marked and traced back to their true origin, to the very hands that had created them. During the meeting, Antonio sat across from Preston Albright with the composure of a man who already knew how the story would end, and he allowed the older man to speak, allowed him to confidently reveal each move, allowed him to believe that he was winning. Only after Preston had gone far enough, after he had placed himself with his own hands exactly where Antonio wanted him, did Antonio gently reveal that he knew everything. He mentioned Gregory, and watched Preston's face briefly change. He spoke of the shell companies, the money trails, and the forged documents, and he made Preston understand that every piece of information he had received over the past several weeks, every move he had believed was clever, had been placed into his hands by Antonio himself. The trap had turned back upon its maker. The hunter had become the prey. For the first time since his plan began, Preston Albright realized that he had never truly controlled the game, that the quiet man sitting across from him had seen through him from the beginning and had waited with endless patience for this precise moment, the moment when the trap would close around the very man who had set it. Everything Antonio had patiently gathered over so many months was now brought into the light exactly as he had planned, not through violence, not through revenge carried out in the shadows of the underworld, but through the very weapon Preston Albright had believed he would use to destroy him, the law, the entire record, the money trails traced through a labyrinth of shell companies, the forged documents Preston had created with his own hands, and that had now been marked and traced back to their source. The evidence that he had bribed Gregory Vance, the proof showing that the Albright family itself had been behind the financial fraud scheme, all of it was assembled into a complete case file and delivered to the proper federal authorities, to investigators with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission, to the right people, through the right procedures, under the law. The net Preston had intended to tighten around Antonio's throat closed around his own instead, and this time there was no shell company he could dissolve in time, no Gregory to leak a warning in advance, because Gregory had now been neutralized, and when he was driven into a corner, his own testimony became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against them. The Albright financial empire, already fractured from within, began to collapse, not in a single explosion, but through a succession of doors slamming shut, accounts being frozen, investigations being opened, and partners scrambling to distance themselves from a name that had suddenly become poisonous. Preston Albright, the man who had spent his entire life in rooms where money and power changed hands in silence, now found himself facing a downfall that all his cunning and cruelty couldn't stop. And in the middle of that collapse, Vanessa came to Antonio. She was no longer the arrogant woman in the brass-colored dress who had torn the wig from his mother's head. She arrived in a condition Antonio had never seen before, her hair disheveled, her face hollow from sleepless nights, and when she began to speak, her voice broke into pleas. She begged him to stop, begged him to consider how completely her family would be destroyed, and in her desperation, something she had hidden all her life began pouring out. Through her sobs, she told him what it had meant to grow up in Preston Albright's house. She spoke of a father who had never regarded his daughter as a human being, only as an asset, a piece on a board, a tool for expanding the family's power. She said that from the time she was very young, she had been taught that her value depended entirely on how useful she was to her father's plans, that affection in that household always came with conditions and always had to be purchased through obedience. She told him that the marriage to Antonio had never been her choice, that she had simply been placed on the board and ordered to carry out her role, that even the insane act of ripping away the wig at the wedding had grown from an insecurity and an inner brokenness she had carried throughout her life, a sick need to prove her power over other people because she had never possessed any power over her own life. Antonio listened, and he wasn't an unfeeling man. He saw in Vanessa a genuine brokenness, a human being twisted by the very person who should have loved and protected her, and it stirred something in him that came close to pity. But he didn't allow that understanding to become blind forgiveness, because understanding why someone became cruel didn't erase their responsibility for the cruelty they chose to inflict. Vanessa had been a piece on someone else's board, yes, but she had also been given moments in which she could choose, and she had chosen to humiliate an ailing woman to win a wager, had chosen to falsely accuse an innocent young woman simply to satisfy her own bitterness. Antonio told her that, not with anger, but with a calm honesty that wounded her more deeply. He said he believed she had been hurt, that he believed her father had shaped her into something she was never meant to become, but that what she had done to his mother and to Katie was real, and that she had to accept responsibility for her own choices, even if she wasn't responsible for the circumstances that had created her. He didn't destroy her beyond what justice required, but neither did he rescue her from the price she had to pay. And when Vanessa left, she carried with her both the ruin of her family and the bitter truth that, for the first time in her life, someone had seen clearly both her pain and her wrongdoing and had refused to let either one erase the other. While the Albright empire collapsed beneath the weight of the law, Charlie faced the most important choice of his life. His brother hadn't handed him over to the investigators along with Preston, even though Antonio could have done so, even though Charlie's authorization code had been the link that set the entire scheme in motion. Instead, Antonio placed the decision in his brother's own hands. He told Charlie that he had two paths. He could remain silent, allow what he had done to disappear inside the mountain of evidence, and hope no one ever traced his role, living the rest of his life with that secret slowly consuming him from within. Or he could step into the light on his own, confess everything to the investigators, testify against Preston Albright, and explain exactly how the man had coerced, manipulated, and used him. The second path meant Charlie would have to face the legal consequences of his own actions, publicly admit the weakness and gambling debts that had placed him in the enemy's hands, and accept that his name would forever carry a stain. But it was also the only path that could return something he had lost a long time ago, his self-respect. Charlie wrestled with himself through many sleepless nights. He had always chosen the easier road, always avoided confrontation, always searched for some narrow opening to slip through rather than face what stood before him, and it was that very nature that had brought him to this place. But this time, sitting alone in the darkness and thinking about everything that had happened, about the humiliation his mother had endured, about the betrayal he had unknowingly helped carry out, about the way his brother was still giving him a chance even though he didn't deserve one, Charlie understood that if he chose the easy road again, he would remain forever the weak man he had always feared becoming. So he chose the difficult path. Charlie went to the federal investigators on his own, and he told them everything, hiding nothing, blaming no one, making no attempt to diminish his own role. He spoke about the debts, about how Preston had approached him, about every transaction he had approved while trapped in fear. His testimony, coming from someone on the inside, became one of the most important pieces that sealed the case against Preston Albright. And when it was over, when the legal price Charlie would have to pay had been determined according to the law, he went to see his brother and his mother at the estate overlooking the bay. That meeting wasn't a tearful reunion filled with easy forgiveness. Antonio looked at his brother with the eyes of a man who still loved him and was deeply disappointed in him. And he said plainly that trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired by an apology or a single courageous act. He told Charlie that he would give him one chance, but it would be a chance with conditions. For 1 year, Charlie would have to begin again, not with his old position, not with his former privileges, but by proving that he had changed through every day, every transparent action, and every right decision. Antonio said he would be watching, not to catch him making mistakes, but to see whether his younger brother was truly becoming a different man, and that only time and action, not words, could rebuild the bridge that had broken between them. Charlie lowered his head, and this time he didn't make excuses or offer empty promises. He only said that he understood and that he wouldn't waste the opportunity. Then he turned to his mother. Rosalind had sat quietly throughout the conversation, and now she reached out and took the hand of the son who had caused her so much pain. She didn't scold him, because she was a mother, and a mother's heart holds chambers that reason can't reach. But neither did she erase what had happened through indulgence. She looked into Charlie's eyes, and in the gentle but unwavering voice of a woman who had survived both illness and betrayal without losing her kindness, she said something he would carry for the rest of his life. She told him that the apology was enough, that he no longer needed to prove himself with words. "Now prove it with your life," she said. And Charlie, the man who had spent his entire life running from responsibility, looked directly into his mother's eyes for the first time, without turning away, and nodded, understanding that the true path toward redemption had only just begun. The months that followed revealed the final price paid by those who had caused it all. Preston Albright was indicted on a series of charges ranging from financial fraud to conspiracy, and the man who had once stood inside the most powerful rooms in New England now found himself seated in very different rooms, facing federal prosecutors and a future that all the money he had left could no longer buy back. The Albright family's financial empire, already rotting from within, collapsed completely, and the name once spoken with reverence inside private clubs was now mentioned only as a warning. Vanessa lost everything. She lost her status, the fortune she had always believed was untouchable, and even the social standing she had once used to look down on others. She left Providence quietly, with no one surrounding her, none of the people who had once flattered her remaining at her side. And although Antonio hadn't destroyed her beyond what justice required, the collapse of her family had already been a heavy enough price. Perhaps somewhere far from this city, she would have the chance to begin again, to face the broken places within herself without her father's shadow pressing down upon her shoulders. But that was a journey of her own, and it lay beyond this story. For Antonio, the downfall of the Albright family brought none of the triumph he had imagined. Instead, it forced him to confront a question he had avoided for years. The entire conspiracy had been possible because his empire still stood along a blurred line between the legal and the illegal, because dark corners still remained, along with hidden money trails and structures that could be exploited and distorted. The lingering shadow within his father's legacy had become the very weapon Preston intended to use against him. And Antonio, sitting alone in his study overlooking Narragansett Bay, understood that if he truly wanted to protect the people he loved, to protect his mother, Charlie's future, and whatever good he still hoped to build, he couldn't continue living on that boundary. He made a decision his father would never have understood. He decided to bring his entire empire into the light, completely and without turning back. He began severing the final ties to the underworld, liquidating the parts of his business that couldn't be made transparent, restructuring everything so that from that moment forward, anything bearing the Ferraro name would exist only under the light of the law. It was a slow and dangerous process, and not everyone from his old world accepted it easily. But Antonio pursued it with the same determination that had built his reputation, because he understood that this was the only way to break the cycle that had bound his family for generations. And amid all those sweeping changes, there was still one matter inside Antonio that remained unresolved, something gentler and more fragile than any business deal or struggle for power: Katie. Over the months, the two of them had grown closer in a slow and unspoken way. She visited Rosalind more often. Noah became a familiar source of light within the estate by the bay, and Antonio found himself anticipating her visits in a way he didn't dare examine too closely. He valued her honesty, the way she looked at him not as a feared boss but as a human being, and the quiet courage she had shown when she risked herself to warn him. Katie, for her part, had seen depths in this man that the rest of the city never witnessed. The tenderness he showed his mother, the patience he offered Noah, and the difficult determination with which he was trying to become a better man. But both of them remained hesitant. Antonio knew the world he was trying to leave behind still cast long shadows, that the path toward legitimacy he had chosen was lengthy and uncertain, and he didn't want to draw Katie and Noah into anything that wasn't truly safe. Katie, whose nephew was her entire world, also didn't dare surrender her heart too quickly to something surrounded by so much uncertainty, and so they remained there, standing on opposite shores of something quietly growing between them, both of them feeling it, neither one ready to give it a name, waiting for a moment neither of them knew would ever come. 1 year later, on a clear autumn morning, the doors of a new building opened for the first time on a street near the hospital where Rosalind had once endured those endless afternoons beside an intravenous drip. The sign above the entrance read the Rosalind Ferraro Center, a place created to support impoverished cancer patients and families forced to choose between paying the rent and buying medicine, the same cruel choice so many people had faced in silence. The center provided free transportation to treatment, helped families untangle complicated insurance procedures, and maintained an emergency fund for those struggling to stay afloat in the middle of a crisis, and most of the initial funding came from the very assets the court had recovered from those who had tried to cause so much suffering. Money Antonio directed straight into something that could ease, even if only in part, wounds like those his own family had once carried. Katie had now completed her training and become the center's head nurse, wearing the uniform she had once dreamed of in those hospital corridors years ago, and every day she became the warm hand beside frightened people, exactly as she had silently promised herself beside her mother's bed. Rosalind, whose hair had now grown long enough to gather neatly at the nape of her neck, stood before a room filled with people during the opening ceremony and spoke to them about the value of quiet human beings. Those who showed up every day without asking for praise, those who were often the very pillars holding up the world while no one noticed. She told them never to let anyone make them believe their worth had diminished because their body was growing weaker, because their money was running out, or because their place in society seemed insignificant in someone else's eyes, because a person's dignity was never found in any of those things. After the ceremony, when the crowd had gradually thinned, Antonio led Katie into a small room at the back of the center and handed her a file she had never seen before. Inside was a legal document created 18 months earlier, during the very week when his mother's doctor first spoke the word metastasis, a trust agreement that had quietly moved the family's most important assets into a place of absolute security, protected from every forged signature, every conspiracy, and every hand that might try to reach them. Antonio said softly that everything Preston and Vanessa believed they could seize had never truly been within their reach, that he had only allowed enough vulnerability to show in order to draw the truth into the light, and that he had never told anyone, not even his mother, because he didn't want her carrying one more fear on top of everything her body had already endured. Katie looked at him and understood that throughout all those months, this man had been quietly protecting everyone without ever asking for recognition, and she realized that this was the truest shape of silent love, not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone carrying burdens that were meant to be borne, not displayed. At that very moment, the sound of small footsteps came rushing toward them, and Noah ran into the room, calling both their names, holding a beautiful stone he had found along the bay and wanted to show them. And in the clear laughter of the child, 3 people who had come from worlds once separated by an impossible distance stood together in a peace none of them had ever dared to imagine. Not a family defined by blood, but one woven from kindness, sacrifice, and the right choices made again and again each day. This story reminds us that a person's dignity can never be measured by wealth, status, or appearance. That kind and loyal people, those who quietly continue doing what is right even when no one is watching, are the ones most worthy of our respect, and that the kindness we give, no matter how quietly, always leaves its fingerprints everywhere, even when we believe no one has noticed. It also reminds us that understanding someone's pain doesn't mean excusing their wrongdoing, that true forgiveness must always walk beside responsibility, and that everyone deserves a chance to redeem their mistakes if they are willing to prove their change through the way they live. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening together to meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And what did it remind you of in your own life? Have you ever known someone who carried such quiet kindness? Or have you ever been the one who silently carried the burdens of those you loved without asking for anything in return? Please leave a comment and share what is in your heart, because we always hope to hear your stories and your thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very final moment, and may everyone watching this video always be blessed with good health, joy in each day, and peace within the soul. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.